So, what makes an African fashion designer? At face value, it is incredibly reductive and condescending and even racist to ask that question. After all, you would never really apply that to European or American designers. We kind of just accept that they exist. It's also somewhat a silly question because a designer just has to be African to be an African designer. But as the world is looking more to the African fashion industry, as we're seeing the platforming of more designers and brands, as there's this expansion of the knowledge, as we have more and more museum exhibitions, I'm very attracted to the idea of coming up with a set of codes, parameters, and philosophies as to what defines African fashion. And part of this is, or part of why I think there is such a increased global interest in African fashion is because our modern global fashion industry is a place where fashion has lost all meaning. It is a place where fashion has no real significant value. And I think that's by design, in order to make us comfortable with the idea of disposable clothing, labor violations, rapidly moving trend cycles, and superficial subcultures that are not so much representations of ideas and thought and abstract feelings, but rather lifestyles and aesthetics that can easily fit into a Google shopping search. And because we have the great fortune of being a developing and emerging industry, I think African designers are uniquely positioned to not only build and maintain an industry that avoids the mistakes of the West, but also brings back that meaning and significance to clothing that I think can go a long way to fixing the fast fashion and environmental issues we're facing right now. So, to answer the question of what makes an African designer, and I'm going to need you to trust me here, I'd like to look at the work of Dapper Dan. Despite being an American designer, I think his work in bootlegging and knockoffs and some of the things that he said best displays the essence of a lot of African design philosophy throughout history. And of course, I understand that I am referring to a continent of over 54 nations and hundreds of ethnic groups and tribes and languages, but there are certain recurring themes that I think a lot of the best contemporary and historical designers come back to, and that I think really encapsulate what makes African fashion kind of unique. And I got to thinking about this last year when the 2025 Met Gala theme was first announced. This year's exhibition, Superfine Tailoring Black Style, is a focus on the Black dandy throughout history, a very long overdue exploration of how Black men have used clothing for rebellion, revolution, personal expression, and very importantly to me, pleasure. I don't know why we can't have one focused on Black women, but I guess that's a conversation for another day. Where the white dandy brought on tailored restraint, this great desaturation of European menswear, transforming it of a language of color and flamboyance to one of sobriety and minimalism. The Black dandy, by contrast, is vibrant and playful and most of all, very loud. To paraphrase fashion designer Tom Brown, fashion should not even speak when it comes to the white dandy. However, for a historically silenced and marginalized figure like the Black dandy, clothing is often one of the few ways in which you can find a voice. All of which Dapper Dan has brilliantly demonstrated in his work, which I think is why so many people literally thought of him straight away when they first announced the theme, and also why so many of us were upset when in the beginning it looked like he wasn't going to be included, but it seems like there's going to be something there, and there better be something there. Like, it's so obvious. And also, of course, there are really great examples on the continent of dandyism. Like, there are so many amazing groups and movements and subcultures like the Congolese Sapiers or South African Swankas, a lot of whom are highlighted really well in this article by Sandisa Ngubane for Wanted. But I would rather have that much more detailed conversation another day when I've been able to do a little bit more research. For now, this is about Dapper Dan and what he taught me about African fashion, which comes down to three basic elements: transformation, theft, and waste. Number 1, transformation. Born Daniel Day, Dapper Dan rose to fame in the 1980s by dressing influential figures like Mike Tyson, LL Cool J, and Alpo Martinez in reworked versions of luxury European brands like Fendi, Louis Vuitton, and Gucci. His work wasn't just about producing direct copies or knockoffs or dupes, but rather they were knock-ups, through which he transformed these symbols of wealth and status, often denied to Black people, into bold, dynamic streetwear pieces tailored to their tastes and needs, such as bulletproof vests, bomber jackets, full car interiors, and coming to define and sort of grandfather in the aesthetic of hip hop and streetwear that we still live with today. I think there is actually a lot to be said about Dapper Dan is basically kind of inventing streetwear as a category, just because of how influential he is, not over just the look and the feel of it, but a lot of the ways that designers approach streetwear and street fashion and hip hop centered fashion today. And how he connects to everything is that his journey as a fashion designer actually began after spending time in Africa in the late 60s and then in the early 70s again, where he was influenced by the vibrant Pan-African and Afropolitan movements of the time that blended, the local and the global, a very act local, think global sort of mindset of the time. And he got to the continent right as this modern African aesthetic was being defined through the revival of local textiles, the rise of African vernacular photography, and the global platforming of the continent's first fashion designers like Chris Seydoux and Sade Thomas Pham. But it was, I think, specifically a cancelled trip to Xhosa in 1974 to watch the Rumble in the Jungle match, which is a boxing match. I don't know, I don't keep up with sports. And because that match ended up being cancelled, he ended up exploring Lagos and Monrovia, which is Nigeria and Liberia, respectively, if you don't know your geography, and starting to see how West Africans were appropriating a lot of imported aesthetics for their very own unique tastes. At the time, he referred to this as Africanizing, which I would like to define as how both continental and diasporic Africans have taken symbols, either forced upon them or denied to them by oppressive systems, to carve out a culture on their own terms. And what you see happening over and over in African fashion throughout history is how people will take things like Western clothing or Christian dress codes and essentially subvert their purpose and meaning and bring it back to something that is true to their own indigenous cultures and beliefs and practices. For example, I think of these Xhosa initiation trousers, which Erica de Grief writes about in Creating African Fashion Histories. She details how, as a part of their initiation into manhood, when they go to Camp Rock, young Xhosa men would receive these trousers, which would also be a necessary part of assimilating into white European society as they probably moved on to become like migrant laborers. This was in the 20th century. But then these trousers would also then become embellished with beading and embroidery, very specific to Xhosa aesthetics and styles. And it's this beautiful rebellion against a sort of imposition of like assimilation and erasure of their identity, tradition, and heritage. It's a very cheeky way to like exist in these white spaces, but still get to hold on to who you are and where you come from without sort of alerting the authorities and the oligarchs. Another example also is you could look at the clothing of the Herero people, which a lot of people love to send to me online, which is very sweet, but I've seen this a lot. And it's because it's these amazing examples of Namibian and Angolan women reinterpreting Victorian era clothing into sort of symbols of their own cultural pride and kind of existing with these, items of the oppressor, these things that were probably brought on and forced upon them as proof of imperial dominance. You can imagine the Victorians especially coming and seeing the so-called naked Africans and being like, you will wear our clothes, and that will be a visual marker every day of your life of how much we rule over you and our superiority. And they have completely transformed the way these items look and what they mean to suit their own case. And I think this is quite bold, especially in the face of having had dealt with some intense atrocities throughout history, particularly a genocide, I think, that's only been recently apologized for. And it's just really beautiful in the ways that they take these like structured bodices and ornate hats and a lot of the silhouettes and the big skirts that we associate with Victorian era fashion and have created something that is so distinctly African. Like, you could not look at that and really truly associate it with the Victorian era outside of just beyond like the shape of it, but like the patchwork and the symbols used and the motifs that is so specific to them. And it's this amazing example of like taking something from the oppressor and bastardizing it in such a way that you can find a voice for yourself and establish dignity and really assert your humanity, especially where it's been so denied. And it reminds me of this quote from Dapper Dan, and obviously this is very specific to the American context, but I think it applies to anyone in the diaspora. And he goes, "We came to this country as slaves. We didn't have our own language. We didn't have our own culture. We have to take these elements of this new culture that's been forced upon us and use that to recreate a culture for ourselves." Number 2, theft. Good artists copy, great artists steal is a frequently misinterpreted quote allegedly from Pablo Picasso, my other favorite non-African artist, which people often use to celebrate blatant one-to-one plagiarism. But when you think about the word steal, which basically means that you take something and make it your own, like it becomes your possession, what you actually realize is that this is a quote about how artists make original work, and also kind of how theft is integral to sort of creating newness and originality. Like Dapper Dan stole from a lot of these European luxury brands, also to the extent that he was almost put out of business from lawsuits. But what he was doing wasn't copyright infringement. He wasn't producing replicas or dupes of the products. Instead, he stole the logos, the symbolism, the meaning, and sometimes even the waste in the products associated with these brands or from these brands, taking things from their trash, taking inspiration from their designs, and then he altered them to something completely new that suited his vision, but with that as sort of a foundation. Like he says, "When I was growing up, if you had diamonds and furs, that gave you clout. So when the big fashion brands began to come out, I noticed how people gravitated toward them, and that what identified these brands was their logo. So I incorporated that symbol in a way that represented fashion as I see it." So what you're seeing here is that like the way plagiarism in fashion works, and I like to advocate that like plagiarism is actually a really important part of the fashion industry. If you think about just the natural way that trends disseminate through culture, where one person will come out with something, and not necessarily new, but sort of a new version of something, and then it will be replicated on the runways, and then from the runways it will go to mass market, and from mass market, us plebs at the bottom will get it. That's sort of your trickle-down system, but you also get the trickle up and you get trickle across. But all the fashion is just aping one another. And the other day I was thinking about the idea of like this African fashion designer concept, and how you sort of have like Sade Thomas Pham and Chris Adu being sort of credited as like the first fashion designers. And that happened in the 20th century, but obviously people have been making and designing clothes in Africa since forever. But I think we've never really had to have sort of a fashion designer because we weren't existing in the Western context, which from the Victorian era started to really depend on this idea of a single individual helming a brand and being sort of the main person we attribute with the creativity and innovation of any sort of fashion products. Like we're very obsessed, even to this day now, with the idea of the creative director as the sole force behind a brand, even though it is the culmination of so many hands and ideas. And I think that was kind of a thing that was accepted in a lot of African fashion for a much longer time. And also, I also think about like the example a couple years ago when Laduma of Xhosa was suing Zara over sort of copyright infringement. And while that's obviously a very different case in which we have this mass manufacturer with obscene amounts of power aping from an independent brand, I did think it was also a little bit of dangerous territory to enter to, because someone like Xhosa works so much from an established framework set up by centuries and decades of continuous cultural development, community work. You know, this is something that so many people have come to together to develop. All of these aesthetics, the beadwork, the patterns, the styling, that is a group project. And I was a bit worried that if we start to sort of take something that is the work of a group, of a culture that is the culmination of so many people's ideas and innovations, and sort of attribute it to a single brand, to a single designer, we might end up into the trap of, you know, ending up at a place where we start removing a lot of beautiful African fashion, or just fashion in general, from the public record. Like, it reminds me a lot of how much Disney has stolen so much IP, where they've just got this horrible cannibalistic approach to IP, that where all these beautiful fairy tales that once were open source materials that anyone could adapt and reimagine in any way they want, is now something you're in danger of being sued to an inch of your life from. If you dare make a Sleeping Beauty story, if you dare have a take on Cinderella, if you want to do something with like, what's another really good story that I like? I don't know, even Pocahontas, which they should definitely not have like IP over at all. But anyways, I'm gonna get off my rant about Disney and how much I don't enjoy the way they operate as a corporate entity. Another thing that's also interesting about the way Dapper Dan steals is also the more important part of that, because it's not enough to just take things and take inspiration or to work within an existing framework. I think what keeps culture moving, what keeps even like the things that we think that are traditional constant and staying with us, is that there's always innovation, and it requires artists and individuals to take something from the sort of cultural community big giant collage board and add your little bit of perspective, add your little bit of view, and that's how we keep things fresh and within like our current sort of mindset and zeitgeist. And what Dapper Dan does really well is he took these things, so he takes the Gucci logo, he takes these Louis Vuitton bags, and he really thinks about, how do I transform these items in a way that fits the people that I want to serve? How do I make this something that translates to a Black visual language, that makes sense to African American activities, desires, thoughts, practices? You know what I mean? How do I take this symbol, these beautiful things that I like or admire or I have some sort of respect for, and I really root them in my culture, and I update them, and I update even the things that already exist in my culture with them. So it's something that's both relevant but also fresh and new. And there's also really great comparative examples historically on the continent of this as well. First thing I think of is like West African weaving practices around the 19th, 18th centuries. So Ashanti strip weavers, when they were making kente, would actually take imported and also like waste materials that were like silks from like Italy, etc. They would take these like fabrics and they would completely unravel them for all the yarns, and then they would reweave that into their own kente designs. So they weren't just happy to accept some of what was waste products from the West. They were like, oh, here is a beautiful foreign material, but I'm going to translate that for something that is true to me. Then you also have something like pellet bite or pellet bite. I'm not too sure how it's pronounced, but this is a Kalabari practice in which they remove threads from foreign material to create completely new patterns. Historian Victoria Alravine explains, pellet bite represents a fascinating amalgamation of local and international influences. By carefully cutting and removing threads from striped or plaid Indian madras to create open work patterns, Kalabari women transform an imported commodity into an emblem of Kalabari ethnicity. And I also bring this up, and I think it's quite important because I think also what's kind of setting apart African fashion in the current context now than as opposed to like the early 21st century or some of the stuff that might have been happening in the 20th century is that I don't think anyone is so happy or so satisfied to just do stuff like taking a Western silhouette and then putting a African textile over it, because that's usually what a lot of people like to term as modernizing. Instead, I think a lot of designers are like really reconciling the fact that yes, we exist in this post-colonial world and we can't deny the impact of Western influence, but we also can't act like we don't have a part to play in these sort of Western products. Either the fact that like we were the laborers making some of these things, or we were finding interesting ways to interpret and assimilate and appropriate these things through history. But we're also in a place now where we want to celebrate our own innovations and our own inventions. And what it means, I think, to exist in this modern context is having to bring those things together in a way that presents a new way forward, where you're not only just a previously disadvantaged or a formerly marginalized person, and you're not trying somewhat aimlessly to connect with a past you will never really have a clear picture of, but really you bring in all these complex and intriguing ideas in a way that really suits your current context and also has something interesting to say about where we exist now. And I just really enjoy the celebration as well, that like everything is shared and open knowledge. And also when we start to remove ourselves of the idea of like possession and ownership in fashion and design, we're not only able to better reference things in our own cultures, but we can exchange and share things with each other. Obviously, a lot of what Dapper Dan's work is essentially a kind of cultural appropriation, right? Which we lambast European houses for, and very much rightly so, because also Dapper Dan explains that as that the difference between cultural appropriation and cultural exchange breaks down to one thing: economics. An exchange involves somebody getting something for whatever it is they have. Appropriation means you ain't getting nothing. And I think what's very cool is also like seeing sort of appropriation or exchanges happen between cultures excluding sort of Western context. Like I'm really interested in the idea of like African Asian interchanging stuff with like cross-cultural exchange between Native Americans and Africans, etc. Because also we have a lot of shared histories and also a lot of shared tastes. And once we're in a place where we've abandoned ourselves with the idea to be original and individual and the first creative person ever, I think we're opening up an entire new world of possibilities and designs and innovations once we're able to move freely around cultural ideas and have open source knowledge systems that we can draw from over and over again. Number 3, waste. So I know that every non-white community and Italians in the world are always excited to tell you about their drawer full of plastic bags and their grandmother who never threw a thing away. So obviously it's not a surprise that creative waste management is a very key tenet of African design. But it always brings the interesting question of like, what is waste? If it's another man's treasure, who decided that it was trash in the first place? One of the first products that Dapper Dan created was a jacket trimmed with the Gucci logo, which he got from the brand's garment bags. And what's interesting is obviously in the hands of like Gucci, these garment bags are kind of a waste product or a throwaway thing. It's just pretty packaging. But through the eye of Dapper Dan, this became a high fashion garment. Because waste is only garbage until you have a different perspective on it. And I think because much of the continent suffers from the dumping of secondhand garments from the West, many of these, which are so low quality and usable that they're just fodder for landfills while the rest of the items devalue local manufacturing, I think it's very important to examine creative ways to approach waste, as we have to unfortunately bear the brunt of Western overconsumption. And I'm really interested in the ways that continental designers are looking at waste and thinking about it and reimagining it. Like I think about the work of a more contemporary designer like Bubu Ogisi of I Am Isigo. And she does these amazing like transformations of waste and secondhand materials into these fantastic otherworldly masquerade costumes. And masquerade costumes are often used in spiritual ceremonies to cast away evil spirits and provide protection. And it's sort of a very interesting comment on like sort of taking these products of like waste colonialism and then turning them into like talismans that act as a way to protect our cultures and our beliefs. And also another interesting thing about waste is that it's just a really good design challenge. Like the other day I was thinking about the fact that like historically there's always these examples of how like Black women, African women are always the best dressed. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that they have to work with so much restriction, that they've always had to work with less. And there's nothing that gets creative juices flowing like having blockers, like having obstacles, like having challenges. And while I'm not advocating for the return of things like sumptuary laws or taking things away from people, what you've seen from African women throughout time is that like you only need a little to do quite a lot. Like I think of the example, something I've spoken about in a podcast is like the sumptuary laws imposed on free Black women in 18th century Cape Town, where despite the fact that these women would have had limited means and limited resources, they managed to be so well dressed that like the white settlers literally put in laws to restrict what they could wear so that they wouldn't keep like out flexing everyone. And still, these women managed to look really amazing. Comparatively, around the same time, you look at the teen young laws in like the Caribbean and America, where because Black women were doing such amazing things with their natural hair, they were forced to start wearing head wraps. But then they got so creative and talented with those head wraps that like that became another issue. And it also inspired an entire movement of Western women in Europe wearing turbans and head wraps. And just once again, I'm just always in awe of the way that you can really come up with some really beautiful creative things when you work with less. And particularly because we are in the system where it's like more, accumulate more clothing, make more trends, have more styles, that like we don't need that to be creative. We don't need that to be stylish. We have so much to work with already in terms of like historical reference, in terms of the things that we own, in terms of the things that we can look to our own culture for. We don't have to keep continually worrying about like things like technology and AI and like how can we use blockchain to improve the system, even though like I know there's some great arguments for all those things, but like sometimes a lot of the progress we want is a lot of the progress we already have. And I just liked using Dapper Dan sort of as a segue into this and a little bit of clickbait, but these are just some really exciting ideas, I think, about the African fashion system as a whole. And I'm sure that are replicated in many other places that are not sort of Europe and America, or white Europe and white America, across the world. But obviously, I just like to speak about Africa specifically. And also because Dapper Dan himself, I think, understands or references a lot of his own philosophy and thinking as something quite inspired and rooted in a lot of African thought and practices. And yeah, that's what I think it means or it takes to be an African fashion designer. In the meantime, I'm very excited about this year's Met, even though I should probably be planning for disappointment. I'm really hoping there's going to be quite a big inclusion or spotlight on African contributions, especially so far. It doesn't really seem like there's much, but we really will only find out in May. But in the meantime, I am working on some research about like the Sapirs and the Swenkers and the Xhosas, etc., and a whole bunch of other continental like subculture movements, particularly around menswear that apply to dandyism, that could sort of act as inspiration. And I'm also going to again make a look for the Met Gala. I did one, I think, like 2 or 3 years ago when the theme was gilded glamour. And I'm really into the idea of doing another one this year, just also because I know so much more about African fashion now. And I'm also really into suiting and menswear lately. So I think it's going to be a really fun chance to explore those things. And also I know I'm supposed to be very careful about announcing projects before I've even started them, because I'm already working on a project now that I announced in February, and I only really got to working now, like almost a month later. But I'm just really excited about that. But anyways, thanks so much for taking the time to sit with me and listen to me yap about this stuff. I was trying to go a little bit more off the cuff today and not be so scripted. I actually wrote this whole thing sort of as a presentation I gave at my former university a couple days ago, where I was just talking about like historical fashion for sustainable fashion future. And I thought it would also just work great as YouTube content. Anyways, if you'd like to keep up with me elsewhere, I'm on Instagram and TikTok as @okbaddykk. I also have a newsletter called Hanger Management, which I should be publishing once a week, which you can also subscribe to. It's on Substack. And if you are interested in supporting me in a financial way, you are welcome to make a donation of any amount to my Buy Me a Coffee account. My Buffy account. I be a bled sometimes. You can also become a member of my Patreon. You are able to join this for free, but the cheapest membership is $1. And there you can get access to my references, research notes. I'll also be trying to work on some like bonus stuff like behind the scenes content, digital downloads. Also, feel free to comment below with things that you would pay to see from me on Patreon. I'm toying around with the idea of like sewing tutorials and things like that, but I would like to actually know if there's actual interest in that before I dedicate a lot of time to doing those things. I don't really know if people care about tutorial or how-to content from me as much as like the other stuff I do, but you never really know till you try. And as always, don't get angry at me. All my sources are linked in the description. I didn't make everything up. I wasn't sucking my thumb. But yeah. Peace. Ugh.